Hey guys, tonight we are diving nose first into the surprisingly riveting history of something you probably take entirely for granted: Rosewater. Imagine, if you can, stepping out of your climate-controlled, air-filtered potentially too clean modern life and being instantly bombarded by the scent symphony or cacophony of the ancient world. Think about the smell of bustling markets piled high with exotic spices and pungent cheeses, the dusty earth underfoot mixing with the sweat of 1,000 people. The sweet, sometimes cloying aroma of incense burning in temples. The distinct earthy tang of animals, horses, donkeys, maybe a grumpy camel, everywhere. It was a world where smells weren't just incidental, they were information. They told you who was rich, perfumed linens, who was poor, unwashed wool, what was happening, a festival with floral garlands, a battle with, well, you get the idea. And it was a world desperately in need of something truly pleasant, something reliably lovely, to cut through the general olfactory chaos. Spoiler alert, finding it wasn't a quick trip to Sephora. You probably won't survive the sheer boredom of the detailed aromatic journey. But hey, let's give it a shot. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And seriously, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. Let's build our sleepy community. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you mentally step back through the mists of time, landing softly in the vast, sprawling Achaemenid Persian Empire, say around the 5th century BCE, the first thing that hits you, truly hits you, is the cell. It's an assault on your senses, a vibrant, overwhelming tapestry woven from threads you've mostly forgotten exist in your sterilized life. This wasn't just a background hum of scent, it was foreground information, shouting at your nose constantly. Picture walking through Persepolis, the grand ceremonial capital. The air here is different from the dusty plains outside. There's the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut stone, the lingering perfume of thousands of people gathered for tribute, the faint, sweet smell of offerings left at altars, maybe even the metallic tang of weapons being cleaned in some forgotten corner. It was a world utterly saturated with smell, and the ability to manage, manipulate, and even create pleasant aromas was a sign of sophistication, power, and wealth. Life wasn't just about the grand palaces, though. Imagine the smells outside the royal court. In the countryside, you'd breathe in the earthy richness of tilled soil, the sweet scent of flowering fruit trees in spring, the dry, brittle aroma of sun-baked grass in summer. Near rivers or qanats, those incredible underground irrigation channels the Persians mastered, the air would be cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and reeds. But there was also the constant, unavoidable presence of animal manure. Essential for fertilizing fields, yes, but not exactly a Chanel No. 5 moment. And personal hygiene, while certainly practiced, wasn't exactly at modern standards, so that if you weren't someone of means, someone who could afford scented oils or regular baths, your personal aroma was probably, let's just say, robust. The Persian Empire itself was a crossroads of civilizations, a massive entity stretching from Greece and Egypt all the way to India. This geographic reach meant a mind-boggling array of smells poured into its major centers. From India came spices like pepper, cardamom, and turmeric, their scents sharp and exotic. From Arabia, frankincense and myrrh, resins that filled the air with heavy spiritual perfumes when burned. From Egypt, perhaps lilies and papyrus. Local sources provided herbs like mint, thyme and saffron, all with their own distinct fragrances. And of course there were flowers, so many flowers. The Persians had a deep, abiding love affair with gardens, and these gardens were bursts of colour, and crucially scent in the often arid landscape. Roses, jasmine, violets, narcissus, each contributing to the olfactory profile of a place. But even with all these natural ingredients, the methods for capturing and using their scents were, by modern standards, rudimentary. People burned aromatic woods and resins, they crushed flowers and mixed them with oils or animal fats to create simple ointments or balms. You might wear a garland of fresh flowers, but that lasted maybe a day. You could rub scented oil into your skin, but it often felt greasy and the scent faded quickly. The power of a concentrated, long-lasting liquid fragrance was still a dream. And while some form of pressing or soaking plant material in oil had been around for ages, the Egyptians, for instance, were pretty good at infusing fats with floral scents, Extracting the true essence, the volatile oils that carry the pure light fragrance, was a whole different ballgame. Historians still argue whether certain ancient cultures had stumbled upon very basic forms of distillation for things like pitch or tar, but applying that concept specifically to capture delicate floral scents was certainly not commonplace, if it happened at all, before the techniques we're about to discuss began to emerge. Think about the state of scent back then, like the state of recorded music before the phonograph. You could hear the music live, smell the fresh flower, you could maybe write down the notes, mix the crushed flower with oil, but you couldn't capture the essence, the pure sound, in a way that was easily reproducible and long-lasting. Ancient perfumes were often thick, heavy pastes or oils, more about masking odours than providing a light, appealing personal scent. They were functional, sometimes ceremonial, but they weren't the airy, complex spritzes we use today. You wouldn't exactly walk into a room wearing ancient Persian perfume and expect people to say, "Wow, you smell nice." It was more like, "Wow, you smell less like everything else," which, to be fair, was probably a huge improvement. So you're living in this empire of intense smells, some divine, many less so. You appreciate the fragrant gardens, you use the available scented oils, you maybe even dab a bit of perfumed fat behind your ears if you're fancy, but there's a gap. A need for something more refined, more purely fragrant, something that captures the delicate, fleeting beauty of a flower's scent without the heaviness of oils or the messiness of crushing petals. And into this world steps, well, a queen. Not just any queen, but one who, according to legend, had a particular appreciation for aesthetics, luxury, and yes, delightful smells. The stage is set for something new, something revolutionary in the world of fragrance, driven by royal demand and the simple, powerful desire to smell really, really good in a world that often didn't. And into this world, saturated with the good, the bad, and the downright questionable smells of antiquity, steps this particular queen. Now, pinning down which queen is tricky business. The kind of thing that makes historians politely disagree over lukewarm tea. Legends, like whispers in a royal court, tend to shift and change over centuries, attaching great inventions to famous names, whether the timeline perfectly matches or not. But the story, the one that drifts through time like a sweet scent on the breeze, points towards a queen known for her refinement, her exquisite taste, and a deep, almost obsessive love for flowers, especially the rose. You picture her draped in the finest silks, perhaps walking through one of those famous Persian gardens, the air thick with the scent of blossoms. Her life, compared to the average person enduring the smell of unwashed everything and outdoor plumbing, or lack thereof, was a sensory paradise, but even Satya, paradise apparently, had room for improvement. You see, while she enjoyed the heavy sweet oils infused with flower petals, maybe jasmine, maybe violet, certainly rose, they weren't quite it. They were functional, yes, they covered up less pleasant smells, they felt luxurious on the skin, and they showed off your wealth because those oils and flowers were expensive. But the essence, that delicate, almost ethereal top note of a fresh rose, the one you catch on a perfect spring morning just as the dew is lifting, that was lost in the thick, fatty base. It was like listening to a symphony recorded on a crackly old cylinder. You get the tune maybe, but none of the vibrant, clear highs, none of the subtle details. The queen, so the story goes, wasn't content with just the tune. She wanted the full, high-fidelity experience. The rose itself held a special place in Persian culture, long before it found its way into potent liquid form. It wasn't just a pretty flower, it was steeped in poetry, art, and symbolism. The ancient Persians cultivated roses extensively in their legendary gardens, which were designed as earthly reflections of paradise. The word paradise, incidentally, comes from the old Persian word paradaiza, meaning walled garden. So you're literally strolling through a garden of paradise surrounded by roses. Not a bad gig, honestly. These weren't necessarily the giant, blousy hybrid tea roses you see today. Think more along the lines of ancient species like Rosa damascena, the damask rose, known even then for its intense, complex fragrance. It was a symbol of beauty, love, and perfection, but also, perhaps ironically given where we're heading, of fleetingness. The perfect bloom lasts but a short time. Capturing that fleeting scent, making it last indefinitely, would be a way to cheat time, to hold on to a moment of perfect beauty. This queen, perhaps named Purandokht, daughter of Khosrow II, though historians still argue whether the specific tale of Rosewater's invention can be definitively tied to her or is a composite legend reflecting earlier, less documented experiments, desired a truer, lighter form of fragrance. One that wasn't heavy and oily, but clean and pure, like the scent just released into the air. She wanted the soul of the rose, not just its crushed body mixed with fat. This wasn't just a personal whim. Controlling powerful, desirable scents was also a form of political soft power in the ancient world. Imagine gifting a unique, exquisite perfume to a visiting dignitary. It was a statement of wealth, sophistication, and access to rare knowledge or resources. It beat giving them a really fancy rock anyway. The challenge was technological. How do you separate the volatile oils, the very soul of the fragrance, from the plant matter and water? Ancient methods primarily involved enfleurage, infusing fats, or maceration, soaking in oil, which produced scented oils or solid perfumes. Burning produced aromatic smoke, but wasn't for personal scent. Fermentation could produce scented liquids like rose wine, but that's a different beast entirely. Getting a clean water-based extract, something light and refreshing, required a fundamentally different approach. It required, well, distillation. Now, distillation is a sort of process where you heat a liquid, turn it into vapor, and then cool that vapor to condense it back into liquid. Simple enough sounding, right? Except applying it effectively to capture delicate plant essences wasn't obvious. Early forms of distillation were used in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt for things like making alcoholic beverages or extracting tars and resins for shipbuilding or embalming. There are hints of alchemists tinkering with basic stills much earlier, trying to isolate essences or produce purer substances, but applying it specifically and successfully to capture the fragrance of flowers in a watery medium seems to be where the Persian innovation, possibly driven by this queen's desire, really shines. Historians still argue whether the initial discovery was an accidental byproduct of some other process, like trying to make medicine or even rose wine, or a deliberate pursuit of a novel perfume technique spurred by royal demand. It's a bit like debating if sliced bread was invented because someone really wanted toast, or because they were just trying to make loaves easier to share. Imagine the scene. The queen expresses her dissatisfaction. Her perfumers, likely highly skilled but working within the confines of established techniques, are scratching their heads. They've mastered the art of infusing oils, creating rich pomades that smell divine, if a bit heavy. They can burn incense that fills a palace with fragrance. But a light, pure, or watery rose scent? That's new. That's a problem needing a solution that doesn't exist yet. They look at the rose petals, vibrant and fragrant, and they need a way to coax that scent out without crushing it into oil or burning it into smoke. They need to capture the invisible, floating fragrance itself. It's like trying to catch a beautiful dream in a net. And the queen is waiting, probably tapping her foot impatiently, surrounded by piles of expensive yet somehow disappointing perfumed oils. This desire for pure captured fragrance, combined with existing, even if rudimentary, knowledge of heating and condensing liquid, seems to be the crucible in which Rosewater began to take shape. It wasn't a sudden lightning bolt of genius, but more likely a process of experimentation, trial and error, perhaps building on existing alchemical practices or even medicinal preparations. Someone, or perhaps a team of people under pressure from the queen, had to look at steam rising from heated plant material and think, what if we caught that? What would it smell like? It's a small leap conceptually perhaps, but a giant leap for the world of scent. And it all started, supposedly, with a queen who simply wanted her favourite flower to smell like itself, but last longer than nature intended. A simple wish, perhaps, but one that would change the world, one fragrant drop at a time. So you have this desire, this royal demand for something purer, lighter, more like the living rose. And you have the existing, albeit basic, understanding of how heating liquids creates vapour, and how cooling vapour turns it back into liquid. This is the core principle of distillation, right? You've seen it happen on a cold day when your breath turns to mist, or maybe condensation on a bathroom mirror after a hot shower. The ancients weren't idiots. They saw this phenomenon everywhere. The trick was controlling it, harnessing it for a specific purpose, like capturing something as delicate and fleeting as a flower's scent. The earliest forms of distillation equipment were pretty rudimentary by today's standards. Think clay pots, basic heating elements, a fire obviously, and some kind of lid or apparatus to catch the steam and channel it. The development of the alembic still, or variations of it, was a game changer. Imagine a pot, the boiler, where you put your rose petals and water. On top of that, a cap or head that fits snugly, with an arm or tube leading away. This arm, often called a line arm, would typically slope downwards into a receiving vessel. Somewhere along that path, or surrounding the arm, you'd need a cooling mechanism, often just cold water circulated around the tube, or even just letting the steam condense naturally as it travelled down a long, cool path. Picture it. Someone is carefully tending a fire under a pot filled with fragrant rose petals and water. As the water heats up, it turns to steam. This steam, crucially, picks up the volatile aromatic compounds from the rose petals. It's like the steam is giving the rose scent a piggyback ride. The scented steam rises into the cap, moves through the arm, and as it cools, boom, it condenses back into liquid form. This liquid drips, drop by precious drop, into the waiting receiver. What you end up with isn't just plain water, it's water that carries the essence, the aromatic soul of the roses. This is rosewater. And potentially, if done correctly and repeatedly, a tiny layer of pure rose oil might float on top, because oil and water don't mix, which is a handy little bonus the alchemist probably found fascinating. This was a major leap from simply soaking petals in oil. That captured some scent, sure, but it was heavy and the oil itself had a smell. Distillation offered a way to transfer the scent into a neutral, watery base, resulting in a much lighter, fresher fragrance. It was like upgrading from a muddy analog signal to crystal clear digital. The early practitioners, likely working in workshops associated with the royal court or wealthy patrons, must have experimented endlessly. How much water? How many petals? What temperature? How long do you heat it? What material works best for the still, clay, copper, maybe even early forms of glass? Each variable would affect the final product. You can almost hear the frustrated sighs and triumphant shouts echoing across the centuries from those ancient workshops. By the beard of Zarathustra, this batch smells faintly of smoke. Or, aha! This time it actually smells like, well, like roses. This technological adaptation, applying existing distillation principles to capture botanical fragrance, is a cornerstone event in the history of perfume and flavouring. It wasn't just about smelling nice. Rosewater quickly found uses in cooking, medicine, and religious rituals. Its purity and perceived health benefits made it highly valued. Think of it as the Swiss Army knife of ancient luxury goods. Historians still argue whether the specific design of the serpent-like condenser tube, which made distillation much more efficient, was perfected during this Persian period, or evolved elsewhere simultaneously. It's a bit like trying to figure out who really invented the spork first. The truth is often messy and involves lots of different people tinkering in different places. The queen, theoretically at least, would have been presented with the results. Imagine her first sniff of this new liquid. Not the thick, cloying scent of rose oil mixed with animal fat, but the light, clean, unmistakable aroma of fresh roses, captured in water. It must have been a revelation. A scent that could refresh, not just mask. A scent that felt clean, almost invigorating rather than heavy and decadent. It was portable, relatively easy to use, and less likely to stain expensive fabrics than heavy oils. This new product, born from royal desire and alchemical ingenuity, had potential far beyond a personal perfume. The process itself became highly refined over time. The classic alembic still, often depicted in old alchemical texts, is a thing of elegant, if somewhat Heath Robinson-esque, beauty. Copper became a preferred material because it heats evenly and doesn't react much with the botanicals. The shape of the still, with its swan neck arm and condenser, was optimized for efficient vapor collection and cooling. It's a piece of technology that remained essentially unchanged for centuries, a testament to the effectiveness of that initial design breakthrough. And it all started with trying to get the smell out of a pile of rose petals and into a bottle of water. Think about the amount of work involved. Collecting vast quantities of fresh roses, we're talking thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of petals for even a small amount of high-quality rosewater. The delicate process of distillation, maintaining the right temperature, collecting the drops of liquid over hours. This wasn't something you whipped up in your kitchen after watching a 5-minute tutorial. This was skilled labour, requiring knowledge, patience, and a lot of raw materials. No wonder rosewater was a luxury good, a symbol of wealth and status. You weren't just buying a nice smell, you were buying the distilled essence of immense labour, vast gardens, and cutting-edge ancient technology. It makes your fancy modern perfume feel a bit less impressive, doesn't it? It's just chemicals in alcohol. This was pure, scented soul captured drop by drop. So you've got this precious liquid, distilled drop by precious drop, smelling like 1,000 gardens after a spring rain. It's taken countless hours, vast amounts of materials, and the combined ingenuity of perfumers and alchemists who probably smelled faintly of singed herbs and hope. Now comes the moment of truth, presenting it to the queen. Imagine the tension. Is it what she wanted? Does it live up to the royal standard? You're standing there, maybe holding a small exquisite glass or ceramic vial, the culmination of all that effort, your palms probably sweating a little more than is historically accurate, but you get the idea. The scene unfolds within the luxurious, perhaps slightly overwhelming confines of the Persian court. You approach the queen, who is surrounded by attendants, the air already thick with the various scents and sounds of ancient royalty. You offer the vial. She takes it, perhaps with a regal nod that says, "All right, impress me." She uncorks it, or maybe just removes a stopper. Closures weren't always easy back then, no screw tops here. You're dealing with beeswax or cork, which could be a production itself. She brings it to her nose. This is the moment of peak anticipation. Does she wrinkle her nose in disappointment, or does her expression soften? And then, the reaction. A slight gasp, perhaps. Her eyes widen just a fraction. The heavy, often animalic scents of the time, musks, civet, things that smelled, well, powerful. Those were the norm. This was different. This was clean. It was like capturing the living scent of the rose itself, light and ethereal, not bogged down by oily carriers or mixed with other heavy notes designed to overpower the general historical miasma. It's the difference between a sledgehammer and a feather in terms of fragrance delivery. Imagine her thinking, wait, it actually smells like the garden, not like the concept of a garden filtered through rancid goat fat. This new substance, this rosewater, is immediately perceived as superior. It's pure, refreshing and versatile. It doesn't just sit on the skin or clothes, it feels like it's part of the air around you. And because it's water-based, it could be used in ways heavy oils couldn't. You could sprinkle it on linens, mist it into the air, though atomizers weren't a thing yet, maybe a splash from a cupped hand, use it to wash your hands, even add it to drinks or food. It was a quantum leap in aromatic technology. It wasn't just perfume, it was an aromatic experience enhancer. This versatility alone would have made it incredibly valuable to a ruler who valued luxury and innovation. The Queen's approval would have been instantaneous and enthusiastic. This wasn't just a novelty, it was something truly novel and useful. She likely would have immediately endorsed it, declaring it the fragrance of the court. This royal patronage was everything. It elevated rosewater from a clever trick by some alchemists to a symbol of imperial sophistication and wealth. It became the official scent, if you will, sanctioned by the highest power in the land, and with that sanction came demand. Everyone who was anyone in the Persian Empire, and those who aspired to be, would suddenly want this new exquisite rosewater. Forget keeping up with the Joneses, you had to keep up with the Queen. This invention, spearheaded by royal demand, aligns with a broader historical fact. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, or later the Sasanian Empire, depending on which historical queen we're focusing on, as historians still argue whether this origin story is linked to a specific queen, like a Tossa, or dates to a later Sasanian consort, was a hub of innovation, trade and luxury. They controlled vast territories, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas and technologies between East and West. Their courts were centres of opulence and refinement, demanding the finest of everything, from textiles to cuisine to, yes, fragrances. Rosewater fits perfectly into this context of a sophisticated empire pushing the boundaries of luxury goods. A quirky tidbit: the ancient Persians were apparently quite fond of elaborate hygiene and personal grooming. They used various aromatic oils and unguents, bathed frequently, and paid great attention to their appearance, especially the elite. So a product like rosewater, which offered a light, clean fragrance and could be used for refreshing face washes or hand rinses, would have been highly prized not just as a perfume but as a functional part of a lavish lifestyle. It's like upgrading from a muddy face wipe to a refreshing toner mist. Definitely a win. You probably wouldn't find them skipping their morning rinse with stale beer breath like some less sophisticated historical types we could mention. The moment the Queen gave her nod of approval, the wheels of production would have started spinning faster. The alchemists and perfumers who perfected the process would have become highly valued. The demand for roses would have skyrocketed, turning rose farming into a significant industry. Regions known for cultivating particularly fragrant roses, like the area around Kashan, would have gained prominence. This wasn't just about making a nice smell anymore, it was about establishing a supply chain, scaling up a complex technical process, and meeting the demands of an empire. It was a full-blown industrial revolution, but powered by petals. Imagine the beehive of activity, fields of keys stretching to the horizon, workers carefully harvesting the delicate blooms at just the right time, usually dawn when the dew is still on the petals and the scent is strongest, caravans transporting the fragrant cargo to the distillation workshops, and the steady heat of fires under stills turning petals and water into liquid gold. And all because one powerful woman wanted a better way to smell nice. It's kind of romantic, in a weird, historically driven, slightly sweaty lab kind of way. And so Rosewater was born, or at least Rosewater as we might recognise it, a light distilled floral essence. It had the royal stamp of approval, the technical backing of a sophisticated, for the time, distillation methods, and the clear advantage of being a clean, versatile fragrance compared to its predecessors. It was no longer just an alchemist's experiment. It was a royal luxury, ready to spread its scent throughout the empire and eventually the world. Its journey had just begun, so there you are, perched precariously on the edge of this historical moment. The queen has given her royal nod, the alchemists are suddenly the rock stars of the ancient world, and fields of roses are looking at their future with a mix of pride and existential dread. The initial wave of rosewater production is underway, and the Persian court smells, for perhaps the first time in its history, like actual flowers and not just, well, let's be polite and say opulence and livestock. But empires, no matter how grand, rarely keep their best secrets entirely to themselves, especially when that secret is something as desirable as a truly exquisite scent that doesn't make you question the hygiene of everyone around you. The Persian Empire, you see, wasn't just a kingdom, it was a crossroads. It sat strategically between East and West, connecting the bustling markets of India and China with the burgeoning civilizations around the Mediterranean. Think of it as the historical equivalent of a major international airport hub. Only instead of duty-free shops and questionable airport food, you had camel caravans loaded with silk, spices, precious stones, and now tiny, carefully stoppered vials of fragrant water. These ancient trade routes, paths worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, hooves, and rolling carts, were the internet of the ancient world, albeit much slower and significantly smellier. You'd get news, goods, ideas, and apparently revolutionary perfumes travelling along these dusty highways or bobbing along on creaky ships traversing coastal waters. Caravans stretching for miles, laden with goods, would depart from Persian cities like Susa or Persepolis, heading west towards Mesopotamia and beyond, or south towards the Arabian Peninsula. Merchant ships hugging the coastlines of the Persian Gulf and venturing into the Indian Ocean connected Persia to ports in India and eventually Southeast Asia. To the north, routes led towards Central Asia, and eventually the legendary Silk Road snaking towards China. Every single one of these paths was a potential vector for Rosewater's spread. A shrewd merchant, spotting the demand and high value placed on this new liquid gold at the Persian court, would instantly see the potential for profit elsewhere. Forget trading bulk grain. This was where the real money was. It was the ancient equivalent of spotting a viral trend before anyone else and stocking up on the product. Imagine the scene: a dusty caravan arriving at a trading post in, say, Babylon. Merchants from different lands are haggling, camels are grumbling, the air is thick with the smell of spices, sweat, and maybe a hint of whatever fuel they use for their fires. Then a Persian merchant, perhaps looking slightly smugger than the rest, carefully unveils his latest offering. He produces a vial, maybe slightly larger or more decorative than the ones used at court, got to market the luxury, and presents it to a local dignitary or a wealthy trader from Egypt. He explains its origin, from the garden of the queen herself, and allows a sniff. The reaction would likely mirror the queen's initial delight, albeit perhaps less dramatic. What is this magic? It smells clean, it's not just scented oil, and I can splash it on things. This is how mainstream historical fact number 5 comes into play. The vast network of trade routes controlled or influenced by the Persian Empire was crucial for the dissemination of goods and knowledge across the ancient world. Without these established pathways connecting disparate cultures and economies, Rosewater might have remained a quirky, courtly secret. But the Persians were masters of infrastructure and administration, maintaining roads, like the famous Royal Road, although that was more about communication, but trade used similar paths, and fostering trade. They basically built the ancient world's Amazon Prime delivery service, minus the annoying cardboard boxes and the questionable packaging peanuts. As Rosewater travelled, its reputation preceded it. Tales of the Persian queen's exquisite new scent would reach the ears of elites in neighbouring lands. Kings, queens, wealthy merchants, priests, anyone with the means and the desire to acquire the latest and greatest luxuries would want this. It wasn't just about smelling good, it was about status. Possessing Rosewater meant you had connections to the powerful Persian court, or at least could afford goods that came directly from it. It was the ancient world's version of having the latest designer handbag or a super rare sneaker drop, instant street, or rather palace, cred. The journey itself was no picnic. Transporting liquids, especially fragile ones in ceramic or glass vessels, over long distances via camel or ship was fraught with peril. Bumps, drops, storms, bandits, any number of things could turn a precious cargo of Rosewater into a fragrant stain in the sand or at the bottom of the sea. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. Merchants often used clever packaging, like wrapping vials in layers of cloth or straw, and sometimes even embedding them in sand within larger chests, to protect them during transit. Imagine the care taken. It was like shipping artisanal olive oil today, only your delivery truck was a grumpy camel with questionable balance. You probably wouldn't want to rely on ancient parcel insurance, if such a thing even existed. Yeah, the bandit took my Rosewater. Sorry, policy doesn't cover sticky situations. The reception of Rosewater in different cultures varied, but its unique qualities universally impressed. In Mesopotamia, where perfumes were already widely used, it offered a novel, light alternative to heavier oil-based scents. In Egypt, where aromatics were central to rituals, cosmetics, and medicine, Rosewater found new applications, possibly integrated into their complex unguents and washes. In Greece, and later Rome, who were already importing Eastern luxuries, Rosewater became a highly prized commodity. The Romans in particular loved bathing and perfumes, and Rosewater fit perfectly into their elaborate thermae culture, used to scent baths or poured over the body after a soak. Historians still argue whether the earliest spread of distilled Rosewater was primarily driven by cosmetic demand, medicinal beliefs, or even culinary use. Yes, it was used in cooking. It's hard to pinpoint which factor was the initial driver or which culture adopted it first for which specific purpose. It was probably a mix of everything, depending on who the merchant sold it to and what that society valued most. Was it the priest who saw its purity as suitable for religious rites, the doctor who believed in its cooling properties, or the wealthy matron who simply wanted to smell divine? As demand grew outside Persia, so did the incentive for others to replicate the process. While the Persians initially held the technical secret, the principles of distillation, even early forms, weren't entirely unknown elsewhere, thanks to the broader flow of alchemical knowledge. However, perfecting the specific technique for delicate rose petals, capturing the true scent, that was the Persian innovation. So while others might try, the authentic high-quality Rosewater likely remained primarily a Persian export for a significant period. Think of it like trying to make authentic Neapolitan pizza outside Naples. You can try, but it's probably not the exact same. The trade in Rosewater became a significant source of wealth for the Persian Empire and the merchants involved. It wasn't just a luxury good, it was a valuable liquid asset. Imagine the accounting. Okay, there's this shipment of silk, that's good. This chest of spices, decent. This crate of glass vials filled with liquid that smells like heaven and costs a king's ransom, a jackpot. This economic impact further solidified Rosewater's importance and ensured its continued production and dissemination. It was no longer just about one queen's preference, it was about global commerce. And so, step by painstaking step, vial by carefully packed vial, Rosewater began its journey across continents. It carried with it the scent of Persian luxury, the ingenuity of ancient alchemists, and the prestige of royal patronage. It was more than just a fragrance. It was a symbol of sophistication, a tangible link to the distant, opulent East. Its story was no longer confined to the rose gardens and distillation workshops of Persia. It was becoming a chapter in the much larger history of global trade and cultural exchange. The scent that started in a single court was now poised to captivate the noses and imaginations of the entire ancient world. So the scent was out of the bottle, literally and figuratively. Rosewater was no longer just a Persian courtly secret, It was a coveted commodity making its way across the ancient world's trade arteries. You can almost picture the scene: a bustling market in Alexandria, merchants from all corners of the known world hawking their wares. Imagine the cacophony of languages, the smells of spices, animals and humanity all mingling under the hot sun. Then a small, unassuming stall, maybe slightly set apart, offering these precious vials. The cost! Exorbitant, of course. This wasn't your average pottery or bolt of linen. This was liquid luxury, fraught with the risks of its long journey. Transporting anything valuable across ancient landscapes was an exercise in optimism and prayer, but transporting liquid was especially tricky. Think about it. Glass or ceramic bottles riding on the backs of camels or swaying in the hold of wooden ships, every jolt, every wave, every stumble was a potential disaster. A single broken vial could not only mean the loss of that precious cargo, but also potentially contaminate other goods in the shipment. Imagine your spices suddenly smelling vaguely of roses. Not ideal for everyone. This inherent fragility added layers of cost, the need for sturdier packaging, slower travel, and higher insurance. If ancient forms of insurance even existed beyond praying to the right god. Speaking of risks, trade routes were highways for goods, but they were also hunting grounds for those less inclined to earn a living through honest commerce. Bandits, pirates, opportunistic local officials demanding exorbitant tolls, they were all part of the landscape. A caravan carrying something as lightweight but immensely valuable as rosewater was a prime target. Silk was heavy, spices were bulky, but a few chests of rosewater, easy to transport quickly after a raid. This is where a mainstream historical fact surfaces. Ancient trade routes were notoriously dangerous, requiring merchants to travel in large armed caravans or rely on the protection of empires that controlled the territory. Without that protection, it was a free-for-all. The Silk Road, for all its romantic imagery, was paved with risk and probably a fair amount of discarded packaging from raids. It wasn't exactly a smooth commute. And the journey itself was long. From Persia to Egypt could take weeks, even months, depending on the route and conditions. From Persia to parts of Greece or Rome, even longer. During this time, the quality of the rosewater had to be maintained. While distillation produced a relatively stable liquid compared to simple infusions, ancient storage conditions weren't exactly climate-controlled. Exposure to heat, light, or contamination could degrade the delicate fragrance. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. Some accounts suggest merchants would carry small samples or even seals from the Persian court to verify the authenticity and quality of their rosewater to skeptical buyers in distant lands. It was an early form of branding and quality assurance, though probably less sophisticated than a modern authentic Persian rosewater sticker. Imagine trying to prove your product was legit to a Roman senator based on a smear of liquid and a broken piece of clay seal. Good luck with that pitch. The demand, however, often outweighed these difficulties. As mentioned, elites across the ancient world were eager to get their hands on this novel scent. Its properties, cooling, fragrant, seemingly pure compared to heavy oils or animal fats used in some traditional perfumes, made it incredibly appealing. This high demand, coupled with the high cost and difficulty of import, naturally led to the next logical step: imitation. Why import something expensive and risky when you could try to make it yourself? This thought process likely occurred to enterprising individuals in various regions touched by Persian trade. They saw the profits being made by Persian merchants and thought, hey, we have roses here. We have stills, or at least distillation methods for other things like alcohol or medicinal compounds. How hard can it be? Well, historians still argue whether the earliest rosewater produced outside of Persia was true hydrodistillate in the Persian style, or simply scented oil, water, or other concoctions infused with rose petals. The process of distilling essential oils and hydrosols, the fragrant water left behind, from delicate materials like rose petals is quite specific. It requires careful temperature control, the right type of still, alembic, and a deep understanding of the plant material itself. Simply boiling rose petals in water gets you, well, hot, vaguely rose-scented water that spoils quickly. Achieving the concentrated, stable fragrance of true rosewater required the specific alchemical knowledge and techniques that the Persians had arguably perfected for this particular appearance. So while imitators likely popped up, their results were probably inconsistent. You might get a weak, quickly fading scent or something that didn't quite smell right, maybe too oily or with off notes. The authentic Persian rosewater, likely produced using the specific techniques honed in those workshops, perhaps even methods kept secret by the Queen's alchemists themselves, would have stood out. It was the difference between a craft cocktail made by an expert mixologist and someone just throwing ingredients into a blender. Both are liquids, but one is a work of art, and the other is probably fine, but not the same. This disparity in quality would have reinforced the value and prestige of the imported Persian product. Wealthy customers would likely pay a premium for the real deal, creating a market for both the high-end import and potentially cheaper, lower-quality local imitations. It's like the difference between a designer perfume bought at a fancy department store and a knockoff from a street vendor. One might smell vaguely similar, but the quality, longevity, and certainly the status just aren't there. The proliferation of attempts at replication, even if initially flawed, is a testament to Rosewater's desirability. It wasn't just a passing fad, it was becoming a staple luxury item that people wanted accessible locally. This pressure to replicate would eventually lead to the slow spread of the distillation techniques themselves, not just the finished product. Knowledge travels slower than goods, but it travels nonetheless, often carried by scholars, travellers, or even defecting artisans looking for better opportunities elsewhere. Imagine a conversation between a Persian alchemist and a Mesopotamian counterpart. So you boil the petals, yes, and the steam goes up, yes, and condenses, yes, but how do you get that smell? The Persian might just smile enigmatically, or perhaps give a vague answer, protecting their valuable trade secret. But over time, through observation, experimentation, and perhaps a little industrial espionage, ancient style maybe involving bribing a key assistant with dates and gold coins, the techniques would slowly be deciphered and adapted in other regions. The early trade of Rosewater was therefore more than just an economic exchange. It was a slow diffusion of a technological innovation wrapped in a luxury product. It highlights how empires, even as they control trade, cannot entirely contain the spread of ideas and techniques, especially when those ideas are linked to something highly profitable and desirable. The Queen might have started it all in her garden, but the merchants and the demand they generated were the engines that drove this fragrant innovation across the ancient world, setting the stage for it to become not just a Persian wonder, but a global phenomenon. So the secret, or at least parts of it, started to leak out. You can imagine the slow diffusion of knowledge, like a drop of colour spreading in a vast pool. It wasn't an overnight sensation everywhere, but a gradual seeping into the minds and workshops of artisans and scholars in neighbouring lands. And perhaps the most significant conduit for this spread wasn't a single trade route, but a burgeoning civilization that was rapidly becoming a melting pot of knowledge and culture, the Islamic world. As the Islamic empires expanded, they absorbed the learning, technologies, and trade networks of the regions they encompassed, including Persia. This period, often romanticized as the Islamic Golden Age, roughly 8th to 14th centuries, was a time of intense scholarly activity, innovation, and translation. Texts from ancient Greece, Rome, India, and Persia were eagerly sought out, translated into Arabic, studied, and built upon. It was like the ancient world's biggest, most ambitious library project, except with added experiments and mathematical breakthroughs. They were basically the OGs of open source, just with papyrus instead of GitHub. Among the many fields that flourished during this era was alchemy. Not just the quest to turn lead into gold, though there was plenty of that too, because who wouldn't want infinite gold, but also the study of chemistry, distillation, and the properties of plants and minerals. Scholars were intensely interested in separating substances, understanding their essences, and creating pure compounds for medicine, dyes, and yes, perfumes. This environment was a perfectly fertile ground for the Persian distillation techniques to take root and evolve. Think of figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan, often known in the West as Geber. While some of the works attributed to him are debated, the tradition associated with his name was deeply involved in systematic experimentation and the development of laboratory equipment. He's credited with describing processes like distillation, filtration, and crystallization. This isn't just about making perfume, it's fundamental chemistry being explored and documented. Imagine his lab, bubbling beakers, strange smells, probably a few explosions before they got it right. It makes modern chemistry class look like a picnic, which, let's be honest, some chemistry classes felt like potential explosions anyway. It is within this intellectual and experimental landscape that Rosewater distillation techniques were not just copied, but actively refined and improved. Scholars and perfumers, the lines were often blurry back then, a perfumer might also be a pharmacist or an alchemist, studied the process, experimented with different stills, alembics, temperatures, and even different varieties of roses. They weren't content to just replicate the Persian method, they wanted to understand the why and the how and push the boundaries. One mainstream historical fact from this period is the significant advancement in distillation technology, particularly the design of the alembic still. While basic distillation was known in antiquity, the alembics developed during the Islamic Golden Age, often with improved cooling systems and more efficient collection methods, were superior for extracting volatile oils and hydrosols from plant materials. This refinement directly benefited the production of high-quality rosewater, making the process more efficient and the product purer and more consistent. They basically took the ancient equivalent of a backyard pot still and turned it into a sophisticated piece of lab equipment. These advancements meant that producing large quantities of high-quality rosewater became more feasible. It transitioned from being an ultra-rare, almost magical elixir produced in a royal workshop to a luxury item that could be manufactured on a larger scale, albeit still requiring significant resources, lots of roses, fuel for heating, and skilled labour. The Islamic world, with its vast territories and extensive trade networks, remember those dangerous routes? The Abbasids and other Zayats worked hard to secure them, became a major centre for rose cultivation and rosewater production. Places like Shiraz in Persia and later regions in North Africa and Spain, Al-Andalus, became famous for their fragrant output. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some historical texts from this era mention the use of specialised containers, sometimes lined with beeswax or other substances, to preserve the delicate scent during storage and transport. They understood that glass or pottery alone might react with or absorb the fragrance over time. Imagine pouring your precious hard-won rosewater into a vessel that makes it smell weird after a week. They were thinking about things like chemical interactions and material science, centuries before those terms were invented. It's like they intuitively grasped the concept of inert packaging. And the demand for rosewater within the Islamic world itself was enormous. It wasn't just for personal adornment among the elite. Rosewater was used in cooking, think of delicate sweets and drinks, in medicine, believed to have cooling and soothing properties, and perhaps most importantly, in religious rituals and for scenting mosques and homes. The concept of cleanliness and pleasant scents was highly valued, and rosewater fit perfectly into this cultural context. This widespread use within the core territories further spurred production and innovation. Historians still argue whether certain specific refinements in distillation, like the use of coiled cooling tubes rather than just a simple condenser, were purely Islamic inventions or further developments of earlier Persian or even Greek techniques. Pinpointing the exact origin of every single improvement in ancient technology is tricky, especially with limited and sometimes contradictory historical records. It's like trying to figure out who invented the wheel. Lots of people probably had similar ideas around the same time, but tracking the first one is tough. The key takeaway is that the Islamic world took existing knowledge, including the Persian techniques for rose distillation, and ran with it, perfecting the process and scaling up production significantly. The spread westward, towards Europe, often happened through intermediaries, particularly via Spain during the period of Muslim rule Al-Andalus, and through trade links with the Byzantine Empire and Italian city-states like Venice. Rosewater, along with other luxury goods, scientific knowledge, and cultural influences, flowed north across the Mediterranean. European crusaders, while their primary objective wasn't Perfume shopping, also encountered the widespread use of rosewater in the Middle East and brought back tales and perhaps even samples of this wonderful fragrant liquid. It wasn't just a scent, it was a symbol of the sophisticated, fragrant world they had encountered, a stark contrast perhaps to the less fragrant state of affairs back home during certain periods. Yes, the Byzantine Empire was another significant point of contact, a bridge between the East and West for centuries. Constantinople, with its magnificent Hagia Sophia and bustling markets, was a hub where goods, ideas, and technologies exchanged hands. Persian and later Abbasid goods, including luxurious textiles, spices, and yes, fragrant liquids like rosewater, found their way there. Byzantine scholars and artisans would have encountered these products and perhaps even the methods used to create them, acting as another channel for the knowledge to trickle westward. So you see these multiple pathways emerging, the direct interactions in places like Al-Andalus, the scholarly exchange via translation of texts, the trade networks linking the Mediterranean, and even the unexpected, sometimes violent cultural collision of the Crusades. Imagine a night, dusty and weary from campaigning in the Holy Land, suddenly encountering the fragrant, clean-smelling customs of the locals, perhaps even offered Rosewater to wash his hands. It must have felt like stepping into a different world, one where hygiene and pleasant smells were a higher priority than, well, let's just say medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for its widespread personal fragrance routines at the time. Bathing was a thing, yes, but perhaps not always frequent or accompanied by delightful scents. The state of fragrance in medieval Europe was interesting. Before the widespread arrival of Eastern perfumes and distillation techniques, people relied on locally available fragrant plants, herbs like lavender, rosemary, and mint, often dried and used in sachets or burned. Stronger scents like civet or musk, when they could get them via trade, were used, but they were animal-derived and often quite pungent. Essential oils as we know them, extracted through efficient distillation, were largely unknown. Perfumes, if you can call them that, were often thick, heavy compounds mixed with fats or oils, or simple attempts to infuse scents. Compared to the delicate, pure scent of Rosewater, it was like comparing a loud brass band to a solo violin. The arrival of sophisticated distillation techniques, initially perhaps through the translation of Arabic alchemical texts into Latin, was a game-changer. Scholars in centres of learning, like the medical school in Salerno, Italy, which had significant contact with the Arab world, began studying these texts. They weren't just interested in medicine. The process of distillation was fundamental to separating and purifying substances, which had applications across chemistry, pharmacy, and even proto-perfumery. Think of them hunched over manuscripts, puzzling out the diagrams of alembics and the descriptions of heating and cooling, probably muttering about how much easier this would be with Google Translate. Initially, Rosewater in Europe was seen primarily as a medicinal substance. It was believed to have cooling properties, good for fevers, soothing for the eyes, and even beneficial for calming the nerves. It fit neatly into the humoral theory of medicine prevalent at the time. Its pleasant scent was a bonus, perhaps making the medicine slightly less awful to ingest or apply, which, let's face it, medieval medicine needed all the help it could get in the palatability department. Here, drink this concoction of herbs and regret, but hey, it smells vaguely of flowers. As distillation techniques became more understood and disseminated, European artisans began to experiment with producing rosewater themselves. This wasn't a quick process. It required specific knowledge, access to the right equipment, alembics could be expensive and tricky to make, and crucially a reliable source of roses. While roses grew in Europe, cultivating them on a large scale specifically for distillation was a new concept. Early European rosewater might not have been as high quality or consistent as that coming from established production centres in the East, but it was a start. One mainstream historical fact is that the technique of distillation, essential for making rosewater as a distinct liquid product, hydrosol and eventually rose oil, was transmitted from the Islamic world to medieval Europe, primarily in the 11th and 13th centuries. This wasn't just about perfume, it was a fundamental technological transfer that impacted chemistry, medicine, and the production of alcoholic spirits later on. So next time you're enjoying a fine brandy, remember that the tech owes a little something to ancient Persian roses. The adoption wasn't uniform. In southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain, where contact with the Eastern and Islamic Mediterranean was more direct and sustained, rosewater became relatively more common sooner. In northern Europe, it remained a rare and incredibly expensive luxury, available only to the wealthiest elites. A vial of genuine, high-quality rosewater from the East would have been worth a fortune. It was a gift fit for kings or popes, a symbol of immense wealth and access to the exotic wonders of faraway lands. You know, like how people feel about bespoke niche perfumes today, but dialed up to 11. Now for a quirky tidbit. During plague outbreaks in medieval and Renaissance Europe, people often carried posies of strong-smelling flowers and herbs or used pungent perfumes, believing the scent would purify the air and ward off the miasma thought to cause the disease. While this wasn't specifically rosewater initially, stronger scents were preferred, the general idea that pleasant or strong smells could offer protection contributed to the growing appreciation and use of fragrances, including the more delicate scent of rosewater as it became available. It was like wearing a scented hazmat suit, except entirely ineffective against actual bacteria or viruses. Still, it probably made being in a plague-ridden city slightly less depressing smell-wise. Historians still argue whether there was any independent development of distillation techniques in Europe that occurred concurrently with the transmission from the Islamic world, or if the European techniques were almost entirely derived from Eastern sources, While rudimentary heating and collection methods existed, the sophisticated alembic designs capable of efficient volatile oil extraction seem to clearly trace back to the advancements made in the Islamic Golden Age. It's a classic chicken or the egg scenario, but most evidence points to the chicken hatching further east and then flying over. So you see Rosewater transitioning in Europe, from an exotic curiosity and potential medicine to a symbol of luxury for the very rich. It started appearing in the inventories of royal courts and wealthy merchants. It was used to scent linen, to add a delicate fragrance to washing water, and occasionally even in elaborate culinary preparations for banquets. It was a statement piece, announcing that you had access to the finest, most desirable products the world had to offer. And all thanks to a potential happy accident with a canal in ancient Persia. Who knew plumbing disasters could be so historically significant? So, while it was slowly making its way into European consciousness, initially via medicinal texts and exotic trade, Rosewater's true moment in the European spotlight arrived as a pure luxury item. You're now moving through the late medieval and into the Renaissance period, say 13th through 16th centuries. The wealthy elite, the nobility, the powerful merchants, that they got their hands on it and they loved it. It wasn't just for soothing eyes or fevers anymore, it was for smelling good, smelling rich, smelling like you could afford tiny amounts of liquid transported across vast distances. Imagine a grand European castle or palazzo, not exactly known for its central heating or modern plumbing, right? Smells were potent. A mix of wood smoke, damp stone, unwashed bodies. Yes, even the fancy ones bathed less often than you might think. Cooking odours, stable smells drifting in. It was a sensory overload, and not in a good way. Rosewater, with its delicate, clean, sweet fragrance, cut through all that. It was literally a breath of fresh air in a rather stuffy, smelly world. The nobility would use it to scent their linens, bedsheets, shirts, handkerchiefs. A subtly rose-scented shirt wasn't just clean, it was opulently clean. They'd sprinkle it on floors, particularly before important guests arrived, creating a fragrant cloud as people walked across the rushes. It was added to bathwater, making the, often infrequent, bathing ritual feel like a truly luxurious indulgence. Imagine stepping into a wooden tub filled with warm water, and instead of just water smell, you get this gentle, floral hint. Pure bliss, medieval style. Rosewater was also used extensively to wash hands, especially before and after meals. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was a social ritual. Attendants would often come around with a ewer and basin, pouring water over the guests' hands, and if you were really important, that water would be fragrant with rosewater. It was a public display of wealth and refinement, way of saying, see, my hygiene budget is higher than yours. Like showing off your fancy hand sanitizer today, but way, way more impressive. The cost was astronomical. Remember, this was often imported from Persia or the Levant, carried by ship and caravan through multiple middlemen. Every step added expense. Plus, the production process itself, requiring vast quantities of rose petals, was labour-intensive. So only those at the very top of the social hierarchy could afford it regularly, really. Kings, queens, dukes, wealthy bankers. These were the people whose inventories listed bottles of rosewater among their treasures. Owning a bottle of rosewater was like owning a small, fragrant sports car today. The trade routes from the east were absolutely crucial in bringing these luxuries to Europe. The Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, became the primary European hubs for this eastern trade during this period. Their ships sailed to ports in the Levant, Beirut, Alexandria, Acre, trading for spices, silk, precious stones, and yes, bottled perfumes and rosewater. Venetian merchants grew incredibly rich, acting as the middlemen, controlling the flow of these desirable goods into Europe. They weren't just shipping goods, they were shipping status symbols. It's a mainstream historical fact that the economic power of cities like Venice and Genoa in the late medieval and Renaissance periods was built significantly upon their dominance of the trade routes bringing luxury goods from the east, including spices, silks, and perfumed products like rosewater, into Europe. They were essentially the Amazon Prime of medieval luxury goods, except delivery took months and involved actual pirates. The demand from the European elite fueled further production in the East and encouraged European attempts at emulation. As distillation techniques spread and improved in Europe, particularly in places like Italy and later France, local production of rosewater began. However, the quality and quantity often lagged behind the established centres. Persian roses were often considered superior, and the long tradition of distillation meant Eastern producers had perfected their craft. So imported rosewater remained the gold standard, the designer brand version. The association of rosewater with luxury and refinement extended beyond just personal use. It became part of the language of courtly love and romance. Gifting rosewater or items scented with it was a gesture of deep affection. Poets wrote about the scent of roses and rosewater as metaphors for beauty and purity. It was intertwined with the aesthetic sensibilities of the age, an era that valued beauty, art, and sensual pleasures, at least for those who could afford it. There's a quirky tidbit about its use in banquets. Wealthy hosts wouldn't just use rosewater to wash hands. They'd sometimes use it in elaborate culinary displays or even squirt scented water from novelty fountains onto guests as a form of entertainment and refreshment. Imagine being at a fancy dinner and suddenly getting spritzed with rose-scented water. A little weird, a little sticky perhaps, but definitely memorable and a flex of immense wealth. Yes, my water feature runs on liquid gold and flower essence, what of it? Historians still argue whether the European adoption of rosewater as a perfume and luxury item was a gradual evolution stemming from its initial medicinal use, or if it was primarily driven by the direct importation and emulation of Eastern luxury practices by the wealthy elite. Was it the medicine that smelled nice that led to its use as a scent? Or was it the desire to imitate the opulent lifestyles of Eastern potentates and merchants? Probably a bit of both, like most historical shifts, but the emphasis and causality are debated. This era, the Renaissance, saw a real burgeoning of interest in perfumes and fragrances in Europe, heavily influenced by the scents and techniques arriving from the East. Rosewater was at the forefront of this trend, opening the door for other floral waters and eventually alcoholic perfumes as distillation methods advanced further. It laid the olfactory groundwork for Europe to eventually become a major centre for perfume production, a story that starts unexpectedly with a Persian queen and a flooded canal. Or maybe not a queen, and maybe not a canal, but you get the picture. The scent trail leads back east. So you've got rosewater splashing onto hands and linens, wafting through aristocratic halls as a pure status symbol of scent. But the story doesn't stop there, just smelling pretty wasn't enough. Oh no, the resourceful people of medieval and Renaissance Europe, having gotten their hands on this precious liquid, started thinking, what else can we do with this liquid gold that smells like a garden after rain? And quickly its use expanded beyond personal fragrance and room freshener into realms you might find surprising today: food, drink, and even religious ceremonies. Imagine you're at a lavish banquet in a 15th century Italian palazzo. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meats, rich sauces, and flowers. Yes, exactly. Rosewater wasn't just for washing your hands before the meal, it was often in the meal. Medieval and Renaissance European cuisine, unlike most modern Western cooking, which tends to separate sweet and savoury quite strictly, often blended flavours in ways we find unusual today. Spices were used lavishly, not just for taste, but as a display of wealth, another import from the East, and floral waters like rosewater fit right into this flavour profile. It was particularly popular in sweets. Think marzipan, custards, preserves, and early forms of cakes and pastries. A spoonful of rosewater added to an almond paste confection gave it a delicate, perfumed sweetness that was highly prized. It transformed simple sugar and nuts into something exotic and luxurious. It was also used in drinks, added to wine or other beverages, again not just for flavour, but for that subtle floral aroma that made the drink feel special. Elite. It was the medieval equivalent of adding a fancy syrup to your latte, but way more expensive and probably didn't come with unicorn sprinkles. Sometimes it would even sneak into savoury dishes, particularly those involving poultry or game, adding a sweet, fragrant counterpoint to rich meats. It sounds odd to our modern palates, but for them, it was just another layer of complexity in a dish designed to impress, not just with taste, but with its expansive ingredients. Serving a pigeon pie with a hint of rosewater wasn't just good cooking, it was saying, yes, I can afford to put perfume in my dinner. This historical widespread use of rosewater and other floral waters like orange blossom water in European cuisine during the medieval and Renaissance periods, especially among the wealthy, is a mainstream historical fact. It highlights a fundamental difference in flavour preferences and the role of scent in food compared to many modern European culinary traditions. We tend to think of flowers as garnish, not an ingredient that permeates the dish from within. Beyond the dinner table, rosewater found its way into more solemn settings, churches and religious ceremonies. The church, often a wealthy and influential institution, adopted many of the luxury goods traded from the East. Incense, of course, was paramount, filling the air with symbolic smoke, but liquids were used too. Rosewater might be sprinkled onto the congregation during certain blessings or procession, cleansing and perfuming the air in a space that could otherwise get quite stuffy and, well, holy, but not always fresh. It was sometimes added to the water used to clean sacred vessels, or even in some instances, mixed into the wax for candles burned on the altar, so that as the candle melted, it released a subtle rose scent. This wasn't just about making the church smell nice, it was symbolic. The rose was often associated with the Virgin Mary, purity, and divine love. Using rosewater in a religious context imbued the space and the ritual with these layers of meaning, adding a sensory dimension to the spiritual experience. It was like spiritual aromatherapy, medieval style. A quirky or perhaps fringe tidbit related to its ceremonial use appears in accounts of royal entries into cities or grand processions. Sometimes fountains in the city square would be made to flow not with water, but with wine, and yes, rosewater, for the public to enjoy. Imagine a public fountain spurting out faintly rose-scented wine. It was an astonishing display of generosity and opulence, a fleeting moment of sensory overload for the common people, a taste and smell of the luxury enjoyed by their rulers. Probably caused a few headaches the next day, but worth it for the spectacle. Historians still argue whether the adoption of rosewater into European religious practice was primarily a matter of embracing an exotic, luxurious scent for symbolic reasons, or if it was influenced by earlier Christian or even pre-Christian traditions of using fragrant plants and waters in rituals. Was it a new trend arriving with Eastern trade, or the continuation and adaptation of older practices using a newly available high-status ingredient? The lines are blurry and the motivations likely mixed. So while we think of rosewater today maybe as a culinary flavouring for Middle Eastern desserts, or a facial toner, its journey through European history involved it being a high society perfume, a hand wash for the elite, an ingredient in fancy puddings, and even something you might catch a whiff of during Sunday service. It permeated multiple aspects of life for those who could afford it, showing just how deeply a single, seemingly simple product can weave itself into the social, cultural, and even spiritual fabric of a society. It wasn't just a scent, it was an experience, a statement, a blessing. And it all started with someone figuring out how to capture the essence of a rose in liquid form, perhaps thousands of years ago, maybe in Persia, maybe by a queen, who knows. The path the scent took, however, is becoming clearer, leading us from ancient gardens to medieval kitchens and chapels. So you've seen how this visly, rose-scented liquid flowed into Europe, gracing the hands of nobility, flavouring their food, and even adding a touch of floral grace to their most sacred spaces. Rosewater was it. For a while, the high-status scent, the versatile luxury import. But history, much like fashion trends or your motivation to do laundry, is rarely static. Change was brewing, quite literally in some cases, in European laboratories and kitchens, and tastes began to evolve, leading to a slow but significant shift away from rosewater's absolute dominance. You see, while the techniques for creating rosewater through distillation were relatively stable for centuries, European alchemists, and later, chemists were busy. They were experimenting with different substances, refining processes, and pushing the boundaries of what they could extract and preserve from nature. One of the key developments that really started to change the perfume game was the increasing refinement and use of alcohol, specifically ethanol, as a solvent and base for fragrances. Think about it. Water-based infusions and distillates like rosewater are wonderful, but they have limitations. The scent is relatively light, can dissipate quickly, and water doesn't effectively dissolve all the fragrant compounds found in plants. Alcohol, on the other hand, is much better at capturing a wider spectrum of aromatic molecules, including those less soluble in water. When you dissolve these compounds in alcohol, you create something more potent, more complex, and crucially, something that lasts longer on the skin or in the air as the alcohol evaporates slowly, carrying the scent molecules with it. This transition to alcohol-based perfumes, known as eau de toilette, or esprit de parfum, marked a fundamental technological leap in perfumery. It's like the difference between a light mist and a proper spritz that stays with you. This historical shift to alcohol-based perfumes in Europe, largely refined during the Renaissance and becoming standard by the Baroque era, is a mainstream historical fact that profoundly impacted the fragrance industry and diminished the relative importance of simple floral waters like rosewater in high-end personal fragrance. It didn't disappear, mind you, but it became less of the cutting edge. Alongside these technological advancements, new scents were arriving on European shores thanks to expanding global trade. Remember those ships venturing across the seas we mentioned earlier? They weren't just bringing back silks and spices, they were also discovering and trading new aromatic materials. Ingredients from the New World, like vanilla and cocoa, had their own unique aromas that could be incorporated, though vanilla was more often a flavouring at first, its scent value grew. From the east came resins like benzoin, gums, and increasingly animal-derived ingredients like civet and musk. These animalics added depth, longevity, and a certain wildness that was very different from pure florals. Suddenly, perfumers weren't limited to the familiar scents of their own gardens or traditional Eastern imports like rose and jasmine used in water bases. They had a vastly expanded palette and a superior medium alcohol to work with. This allowed for the creation of more intricate, multi-layered fragrances. Perfumes became heavier, more complex, sometimes quite intense by our modern standards. Early musk perfumes could be a lot. Rose still featured, often prominently, but now it was blended with other florals, spices, resins, and animalics, losing its solo spotlight status as the ultimate refined scent. European tastes were also changing, both in scent and in food. In cuisine, the medieval love affair with blending sweet, savoury, and fragrant elements started to wane in the aristocratic kitchens that set trends. As culinary techniques evolved, there was a greater emphasis on clarifying flavours, separating courses, and distinct taste profiles. The subtle, sometimes perceived as old-fashioned floral sweetness of rosewater began to fall out of favour compared to new spices, or the growing sophistication of sauces and preparations that didn't require perfuming. Rosewater didn't vanish from European kitchens entirely. It persisted in certain regional sweets and traditional recipes, much like your grandma might still use a recipe passed down through generations that includes a dash of something you'd never think to add today. But it lost its status as a must-have ingredient in high-status cookery. As for personal fragrance, the shift towards heavier, more complex alcohol-based perfumes also reflected a change in what was considered desirable. The 17th and 18th centuries, especially in places like France, saw an explosion in the variety and strength of perfumes. Cities could be quite smelly places before modern sanitation, so people often desired strong scents to mask less pleasant odours. Simple, clean floral water perhaps wasn't quite up to the job anymore. A quirky or perhaps fringe tidbit from this period relates to some of the early experiments with creating these alcohol-based scents and using new materials. Before refinement was perfect, alcohol itself could have a harsh smell, and some of the new ingredients were incredibly potent. There are accounts of early perfumers trying to extract scents from things we might find bizarre, like trying to distill the essence of, well, let's just say not all experiments smelled like roses. Or how about the use of civet? This ingredient, scraped from a gland of the civet cat, has a truly animalic fecal smell in its raw form, but when diluted heavily, it adds incredible warmth, longevity and complexity to a perfume, giving it a rich base note. The idea of deliberately adding something that smells faintly of, well, cat business, to your fancy perfume might seem wild now, but it was cutting edge back then. Historians still argue whether the decline of rosewater's primary role in European perfumery and cuisine was a natural consequence of technological progress, alcohol bases, new ingredients, a change driven purely by evolving fashion and taste preferences, or if it was tied to broader cultural shifts. Perhaps even a subconscious desire to differentiate European luxury from the Eastern traditions that had initially supplied it. Was it simply that alcohol perfumes were objectively better at scent delivery, or did Europe consciously develop its own fragrance identity distinct from the water-based traditions it had imported? The truth is probably a complex cocktail of all these factors, shaken, not stirred, with a twist of vanilla and musk. So while rosewater continued to be produced and used, its golden age as the undisputed king of scent and a premier culinary aromatic in elite European circles gradually faded. It was still around, but it was no longer the newest, most exciting thing. The spotlight shifted to the potent, long-lasting, complex blends made possible by alcohol and a world of new aromatic materials, leaving rosewater to occupy a more modest niche, though its legacy and continued use would ensure it never vanished entirely from the global stage. But its time as the defining scent of European luxury was drawing to a close, making way for new olfactory adventures. So while Europe was getting all excited about their new alcohol-based potions and musky blends, pushing rosewater off its gilded throne as the ultimate scent, it didn't just vanish into the mists of history like a bad Renaissance haircut. Oh no. Rosewater was far too useful, far too beloved, and culturally ingrained in too many places to simply disappear because some fancy European perfumer's doll has found a new toy. Think of it like cassette tapes. They might not be mainstream anymore, but there's still a whole subculture of people who love the warmth and nostalgia, and they're definitely not extinct. Rosewater found its enduring place persisting globally and adapting, finding new uses and markets, often outside the very European elite circles that had initially adopted it so enthusiastically. You see, the heartland of rose cultivation and rosewater production, the Middle East and Persia, which had become the centre of a vast dynamic Islamic world, never stopped using it. For them, it wasn't just a passing trend it was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, religious practice and cultural identity. While Europe dabbled and then moved on to heavier scents, in cities like Baghdad, Damascus and later Isfahan, the air still carried the sweet, clean scent of roses. Rosewater was used for washing hands before and after meals, offered to guests as a sign of hospitality, sprinkled in mosques for purification and fragrance, and continued to be a vital ingredient in traditional sweets and beverages. It was a staple, a necessity, not a fleeting luxury. This sustained, widespread use in its regions of origin is a mainstream historical fact that ensured Rosewater's survival and continued prominence, regardless of changing fashions thousands of miles away. Its journey eastward was just as significant. The knowledge of distillation and the use of rosewater spread with Islamic trade and influence into the Indian subcontinent. Here too, it was enthusiastically adopted and integrated into local customs. In Mughal India, rosewater was a sign of sophistication and refinement. It was used in lavish feasts, incorporated into cooling drinks, and applied to the body to combat the heat and humidity. The famous Mughal gardens were often designed with water features that were sometimes scented with rose petals or a dash of rosewater, creating an atmosphere of serene luxury. It became an essential element in Indian sweets and biryanis, adding a delicate floral note that is still cherished today. So while European aristocracy might have been dabbing on heavy musks, the emperors and nawabs of India were still enjoying the subtle elegance of rosewater. Even within Europe, rosewater didn't completely disappear. While the perfumers moved on, it retained its place in less fashionable or more traditional contexts. Apothecaries continued to sell it for its perceived medicinal properties, soothing for the skin, good for the eyes, even taken internally for various ailments. It remained a popular choice for simple toiletries and cosmetics for those who couldn't afford or didn't desire the new, expensive alcohol-based perfumes, or for those who simply preferred its light, natural scent. It also held on stubbornly in the kitchen, especially in sweets. Think of marzipan in Germany, Turkish delight, which ironically gained popularity in Europe later, or certain pastries and puddings in various regions. Many traditional recipes retained rosewater as a key flavouring element, a nod to those earlier culinary traditions. Its persistence in medicinal and cosmetic applications highlights its versatility beyond just being a perfume base. Ancient texts had long spoken of the healing properties of roses, and while some of these claims were perhaps exaggerated, the soothing anti-inflammatory properties of rosewater were genuinely beneficial for skin irritations and eye rinses. It was a far cry from the elaborate, chemically complex concoctions emerging from European laboratories, but it was practical, effective, and affordable for many people. A quirky tidbit about rosewater's survival is its surprising role in masking unpleasant industrial smells during the early periods of manufacturing and urbanization. While aristocrats used heavy perfumes to combat city smells, simpler establishments like tanneries or areas processing certain goods would sometimes use copious amounts of rosewater or other strong floral waters, not as a luxury, but as a basic form of air freshener. Imagine walking past a place with interesting smells and getting a sudden whiff of roses trying its best to cover things up. It was the historical equivalent of those industrial-sized air fresheners, but with a much more ancient pedigree. It shows how rosewater could adapt and find utility even in the grittiest environments, far removed from the perfumed gloves and powdered wigs of the elite. Historians still argue whether the continued widespread cultivation of roses, specifically for rosewater production in regions like Persia and the Levant, was driven primarily by consistent local and regional demand, or if it was sustained in part by a persistent, albeit less prominent, export market to Europe for these more traditional uses, flavouring, medicine, basic cosmetics, even as the high-end perfume market moved on. Was the primary economic engine internal, meeting the needs of daily life and tradition across the Islamic world and India, Or did European niche demand still play a significant role in keeping the rose farms profitable? It's a complex economic question, intertwined with cultural practices and trade routes that shifted over centuries. Rosewater also played a fascinating role in religious ceremonies across different faiths. In Islamic tradition, it was, and is, used to clean sacred spaces and graves. In some Christian traditions, it was used in churches, echoing its use in medieval times. In various festivals and ceremonies in India, rosewater is sprinkled as a blessing or an offering. This deep integration into ritual gave it a resilience that fashion trends couldn't touch. It wasn't just about smelling nice, it was about purity, blessing, and tradition. Think about the simple process we discussed earlier, harvesting petals, the distillation. While the technology for alcohol-based perfumes became more complex and industrial over time, rosewater production could remain relatively accessible. Small producers could continue making it using time-tested methods, ensuring a steady supply for local markets and traditional uses. It didn't require the same level of chemical knowledge or large-scale investment as the emerging perfume industry. This accessibility likely contributed significantly to its persistence, making it available to a broader range of people than the expensive new alcoholic scents. So, while the European narrative often focuses on the rise of alcohol perfumes or replacing rosewater in the elite sphere, the global story is one of coexistence and adaptation. Rosewater didn't lose, it just shifted lanes and continued its journey, cherished in its homelands, adopted into new cultures to the east, and finding practical, traditional niches even in the regions that had moved on to other things. It reminds us that history isn't always about complete replacement. Sometimes old ways persist and thrive alongside the new, especially when they are rooted in deep cultural practices and genuine utility. The quiet scent of rosewater continued to waft through homes, kitchens, and sacred spaces, a testament to its enduring appeal and the wisdom of ancient traditions that valued its simple elegance. It wasn't the star of the European ballrooms anymore, but it was still the beloved fragrance of countless homes and rituals across half the world. And this persistence wasn't just about the liquid, the fragrant water itself. It was intrinsically tied to the plant, the source of it all. We're talking about the very specific, very special rose varietal that yielded the most prized oil and water. Rosa damascena, the damask rose. This wasn't just any old rose you might find growing wild on a hedgerow, though those have their charm, of course. This was a plant cultivated, nurtured, and transported across vast distances, its story a botanical epic in itself, paralleling the journeys of its fragrant extract. You see, for rosewater to persist, the roses themselves had to thrive wherever they went, adapting to new soils and climates, a testament to their own quiet resilience. The origins of Rosa damascena are, like many ancient things, a little fuzzy around the edges. Most botanists and historians lean towards the belief that this rose originated somewhere in the Middle East or Persia, likely a natural hybrid or cultivated selection from wild roses in the region. It's thought to be a cross between Rosa gallica, the French rose, and Rosa phoenicia, the Phoenician rose, perhaps with some contribution from Rosa machata, the musk rose. Imagine ancient plant breeders, long before genetics was a word, just noticing a particularly beautiful, fragrant and prolific rose and deciding, yeah, this one's a keeper. They wouldn't know the scientific names, of course, but they'd know a winner when they smelled it. This region, the cradle of civilization, wasn't just giving us writing and wheels, it was perfecting pretty flowers too. From its probable birthplace, the damask rose began its slow but steady migration. Its beauty and, crucially, its intense fragrance made it a desirable plant to carry. Early travellers, merchants, and later soldiers and pilgrims would take cuttings or seeds with them, a piece of beauty or home to transplant in new lands. You can picture some weary merchant on the Silk Road, carefully tending a thorny twig wrapped in damp cloth, probably muttering about how much easier it would be just to carry silk, but knowing this little stick was worth more in some markets than gold. It was like carrying precious cargo, but prickly. One of the most commonly cited ways the damask rose reached Europe in significant quantities was during the Crusades. Returning crusaders, encountering the stunning gardens of the Holy Land, often brought back treasures, and amongst the silks and spices were plants, including the highly prized damask rose. This transfer of plants from the Middle East to Europe is a mainstream historical fact that profoundly influenced European horticulture and botany, bringing not just the damask rose, but other species that enriched European gardens and agriculture. Suddenly, European nobility weren't just hearing tales of fragrant eastern gardens, they could try to recreate them, or at least have a bush of the famous rose themselves. Though trying to get a Rosa damaskina to produce commercial quantities of petals in, say, soggy England, wasn't always a roaring success initially. It has specific needs, this rose. The rose didn't just spread west, it travelled east and south too. Its cultivation expanded within the Islamic world, reaching places like North Africa, Andalusia in Spain, and the Indian subcontinent, often carried along the same trade routes that disseminated rosewater and distillation knowledge. Wherever conditions were suitable, warm, sunny climates, well-drained soil, the damask rose found a new home. In India it flourished, becoming an integral part of the landscape and culture, particularly in the northern regions under Mughal influence. The Mughals, with their Persian heritage, brought a deep love for roses and garden design, ensuring the damask rose became firmly established. A quirky tidbit about Rosa damaskina is its unique flowering pattern. Unlike many modern roses that bloom repeatedly throughout the season, the damask rose is typically once blooming. It produces a massive, spectacular flush of flowers over a few intense weeks in late spring or early summer. And then, that's it for the year. This single, prolific bloom is what makes the harvest season so crucial and concentrated. Imagine trying to harvest enough petals for all that rosewater production, but you only get one shot at it every year. It's like having a single, massive Black Friday sale for your entire year's inventory. But the inventory is delicate, fragrant petals that have to be picked before the sun gets too hot. This intense seasonality shaped the economics and logistics of rosewater production for centuries, requiring huge numbers of pickers for a short, frantic period. Historians still argue whether the spread of Rosa damaskina was primarily driven by demand for its fragrant oil and water, making it a purely commercial crop transported for profit, or if its aesthetic appeal and symbolic value as a beautiful, often sacred flower played an equally or even more significant role in its initial dispersal by travellers and cultivators. Was it carried for wealth or for wonder? Probably a bit of both, because who wouldn't want a rose that looks and smells that good? The adaptability of the damask rose is quite remarkable. While it thrives in specific climates like Bulgaria's Rose Valley or parts of Iran and Turkey, it has managed to establish itself in many other places, crossbreeding over time or developing local land races slightly different from the original stock. This genetic flexibility allowed it to persist and spread wider than a less adaptable plant might have. It learned to handle different amounts of rainfall, varying soil types, and slightly colder or hotter temperatures than its presumed homeland. Think about how a single plant species, through human desire and natural resilience, managed to traverse continents, becoming a symbol of love, beauty, and luxury wherever it went. It wasn't just a passive object, it was a living thing that had to survive the journey and then flourish in a new environment. You can almost picture the tiny roots pushing into foreign soil, the leaves unfurling under unfamiliar sun, a silent, determined expansion happening one garden, one field, one continent at a time. It's a history carried on the wind, on trade ships, and in the hands of pilgrims, wrapped up in the scent of its own petals. So you've got this special rose, the damask, making its way across continents, finding new homes, and bringing its intense fragrance with it. And alongside it, or slightly ahead or behind depending on the caravan, travels the knowledge of distillation, the techniques to extract that precious scent into the liquid gold we call rosewater. This confluence created a commodity of immense value, not just for vanity, though honestly that was a big part of it, but for a surprising array of uses that made rosewater indispensable in the medieval world, particularly within the expanding Islamic empires. Forget what you think you know about simple perfumes. Rosewater wasn't just splashed on wrists. It was a star player in medicine, a key ingredient in haute cuisine, a cleansing agent, a religious offering, and a symbol of wealth and status all rolled into one incredibly fragrant package. Its value wasn't just perceived, it was economic. We're talking about a product that could fetch high prices in distant markets, driving trade and agricultural development. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of, I don't know, saffron mixed with crude oil, if that makes any sense. Highly prized, globally traded, and used for everything. In the realm of medicine, for instance, rosewater was considered a panacea for various ailments. Ancient physicians like Galen had already noted the medicinal properties of roses, and this knowledge was expanded upon and codified by scholars during the Islamic Golden Age. You'd find prescriptions recommending rosewater for everything from headaches and eye infections to digestive issues, and even emotional distress. It was believed to be cooling and strengthening, soothing to the nerves, and beneficial for the heart and brain. Imagine your doctor today prescribing a sniff of expensive floral water for your migraine. You'd probably raise an eyebrow, right? But back then it was serious science, or at least the best available science. They used it as an antiseptic wash, a base for medicinal syrups, and applied it externally to soothe skin conditions. It was the aspirin, the eye wash, and the aromatherapy all in one pretty bottle. And the culinary uses. Oh, the culinary uses were divine. Rosewater wasn't merely a flavouring, it was an essential component in sweets, pastries, and even some savoury dishes, especially in Persian, Ottoman, and Indian cuisine. Think of delicate sorbets, rice puddings, remember that sort of from earlier? Cakes and confections infused with its floral notes. It could cut through richness, add a layer of complexity, and elevate simple ingredients into something truly luxurious. The famous Turkish delight, often flavoured with rosewater. Indian sweets like gulab jamun or barfi, rosewater makes them sing. It was the secret ingredient that turned a good dessert into a royal treat. It wasn't just sprinkling a little, it was integral to the flavour profile, a sign of a sophisticated kitchen. Beyond the practical, rosewater held significant symbolic and ritualistic importance. It was used in religious ceremonies, sprinkled in mosques, and offered as a sign of respect and welcome. In many cultures, roses were associated with purity, love, and divinity, and rosewater inherited these connotations. Washing hands with rosewater before a meal or a prayer wasn't just about hygiene, it was a symbolic purification. Gifting rosewater was a gesture of honour. Even bathing in water infused with rosewater was a luxury indulged in by the wealthy, a practice that wasn't just about smelling nice, but about feeling refreshed and possibly even spiritually cleansed. It was the original fancy soap, essentially, but with a much deeper meaning. The high economic value of rosewater is a mainstream historical fact. It was a major export commodity for regions like Persia and later, parts of the Levant and North Africa, generating considerable wealth for producers and merchants. Its price fluctuated depending on supply and demand, but consistently commanded a premium, especially in markets far from where the roses were grown and distilled. Control over rose fields and distillation techniques could be a source of political and economic power. This wasn't just a cottage industry. In some areas, it was big business, shaping local economies and international trade networks. A quirky tidbit is that in some places, rosewater was even used as a form of medieval air freshener or disinfectant, not in aerosol cans obviously, but perhaps sprinkled on floors or fabrics to mask unpleasant odours, in places where sanitation wasn't exactly top tier. Imagine trying to make a bustling medieval city smell vaguely pleasant using just buckets of flower water. It was probably a losing battle most of the time, but hey, points for effort and ambition, right? It gives you a sense of just how pervasive and versatile the substance was, used not just for pleasure, but also for practical, if sometimes Sisyphean, tasks. Historians still argue whether the sheer volume of rosewater produced and traded indicates a centralized, industrial-scale production system in certain key areas, or if it remained largely a collection of smaller localized distilleries feeding into larger trade networks. Were there massive ancient rosewater factories, or was it more of a widespread artisanal craft? The scale suggested by trade records seems enormous, hinting at a level of organization that might surprise you for the period. The demand fueled innovation in distillation technology, leading to more efficient still designs and improved techniques for separating the precious oil, rose otto, from the hydrosol, rosewater. This continuous refinement meant that the quality and yield of rosewater improved over centuries, further cementing its place as a staple luxury good. It wasn't stagnant technology. There were advancements driven by profit and a constant need for more, better, and cheaper rosewater. Consider the sheer logistics involved. Growing fields of these once blooming roses, harvesting the petals during that narrow window, transporting them quickly to stills, processing them with fire and water, and then packaging and shipping the fragile liquid. It was an undertaking that required significant coordination and labour, from the farmers tending the plants to the distillers working the stills and the merchants carrying the finished product across deserts and seas. It was a complex operation built entirely around capturing a fleeting fragrance. And this widespread use and high value weren't just confined to the Islamic world. As knowledge and trade routes expanded, rosewater became increasingly popular in Europe, especially from the Renaissance onwards, solidifying its status as a truly global commodity, connecting cultures through scent, medicine, and cuisine. It travelled with explorers, was prized by royalty, and became a symbol of refinement and sophistication in European courts. The queen who supposedly invented it might have been in Persia, but her fragrant legacy was now delighting palates and soothing skin all the way to the Atlantic. So this fragrant water, a symbol of purity and luxury, had become a global phenomenon, a staple in royal courts and common kitchens alike, traversing the known world on ships and caravans. But the story doesn't end in the medieval period with trade routes crisscrossing the globe. Rosewater's journey continued, adapting and evolving alongside human history. It weathered empires rising and falling, the age of exploration, the Industrial Revolution, and the advent of modern chemistry and perfumery, somehow maintaining its unique position in the world. Even as synthetic fragrances began to emerge in the late 19th and 20th centuries, offering cheaper and more stable alternatives to natural extracts, rosewater held its ground. Why? Because it wasn't just about the smell. It carried centuries of cultural weight, traditional knowledge, and a perceived natural purity that synthetics couldn't replicate. Plus, nothing really smells like true high-quality rose absolute or rosewater, does it? It has a depth and complexity that's hard to fake, is the difference between elevator music and a live orchestra playing your favourite piece. Today you encounter rosewater in places you might not even consciously register. It's in high-end cosmetic toners and face mists, lauded for its soothing and anti-inflammatory properties. You'll find it in artisanal ice creams, delicate pastries, and fancy cocktails, bringing that subtle, romantic floral note. Many traditional cuisines, particularly across the Middle East, India, and parts of North Africa and the Mediterranean, still rely heavily on it for flavouring sweets and drinks. It's even present in some cleaning products now, ironically, bringing us full circle from its ancient use as a basic cleanser. The process of making it hasn't fundamentally changed, not in its essence. You still need mountains of rose petals, steam, and a still. Modern technology has certainly improved efficiency and quality control, preventing things like, say, accidental cockroach distillation, which, while perhaps adding a certain je ne sais quoi, probably isn't ideal for commercial viability. But the core principle, gently coaxing the fragrant essence from the flower using water and heat, remains a testament to ancient ingenuity. A mainstream historical fact is that the production of rose oil, rose otto, and rosewater remains a significant agricultural and economic activity in specific regions globally, such as Bulgaria, Turkey, Iran, and Morocco. These areas benefit from the ideal climate and soil conditions for growing the damask rose, continuing a tradition that spans over 1,000 years. It's not just a historical curiosity, it's a vital part of their modern economies, employing thousands of people from cultivation to distillation and export. A quirky tidbit is that some traditional remedies still advocate for using rosewater to soothe irritated eyes, a practice that echoes its ancient medicinal use. While modern ophthalmology has obviously moved on, the persistence of this belief highlights how deeply ingrained rosewater is in folk medicine and traditional healing practices across various cultures. Just maybe check with an actual doctor before you try it, okay? We're telling a story here, not giving medical advice. Historians still argue whether the widespread cultivation of the damask rose specifically for distillation purposes originated solely in Persia or if parallel developments occurred relatively independently in other regions of the Middle East around the same time, possibly influenced by earlier Roman or Greek perfumery techniques. Pinpointing the exact ground zero for the industry can be tricky when dealing with fragmented historical records and the organic spread of agricultural practices. The enduring appeal of rosewater speaks to something fundamental about human connection to nature and scent. In a world increasingly dominated by artificial smells, the simple, pure fragrance of distilled roses continues to captivate. It offers a link back to simpler times, perhaps, or maybe just reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful things are those crafted directly from the earth, with a little bit of human ingenuity and a lot of patience. It's a scent that carries history within its delicate molecules, a fragrant whisper across centuries. And so, the story of rosewater, which potentially began with a Persian queen's desire for something pure and fragrant, flows all the way to your modern bathroom cabinet or kitchen cupboard. It's a long, winding tale of petals and stills, trade routes and empires, medicine and dessert, all connected by the enduring power of a simple flower and the water that captures its soul. It's a reminder that even the most mundane items we use every day can have roots stretching back into the mists of time, carrying echoes of ancient lives and innovations. You hold a piece of that history in your hands every time you use it. As you settle deeper, feeling the weight lift from your shoulders, the faint scent of imagined roses seems to soften, becoming less about history and more about the quiet stillness of the moment. The intricate details of ancient stills and bustling bazaars begin to fade, replaced by a gentle, calming sense of peace. The historical journey is complete now, the story of the queen, the alchemists, the merchants, and the petals, letting all those images gently dissolve, just the soft echo of a fragrance, a reminder of the long path this simple liquid has travelled. Feel your breath deepening, slowing, each inhale soft, each exhale releasing any lingering tension, allowing the quiet stillness to wash over you, drifting, into the gentle embrace of sleep, the whispers of history fading, leaving only peace and quiet.